At a young age, children begin to develop a sense of what's normal for boys and girls. Boys play with cars and girls play with dolls. But my mother taught me to do what I loved, regardless of whether it was for boys or not. So I became the only male gymnast in the year, the only boy who preferred drawing to football. And the difference between the other boys and I used to be pretty much unnoticeable, until one day in grade 7. And I remember this day very vividly in my head. I look up to my sister, and I used to copy her behavior. So naturally, some of the behavioral dispositions that I garnered over the following years were deemed relatively feminine. You know how girls sit with their legs crossed with one leg over the other when they're wearing a dress? I had to sit like that because I thought that was normal. I was sitting in English class reading a book on a sofa with one leg crossed over the other. And one boy comes up to me and says, "Yash, what are you doing? That is such a girly and gay way of sitting." I was stunned. What did he mean by a girly way of sitting? How could only girls sit in a certain way? What was gay? These thoughts were running through my mind, and just as I tried to compose myself and respond to him, another classmate chimed in. "Yash, why are you copying the girls? That's not normal for guys." And I was confused. And bit by bit, classmates started joining in, asking me why I was copying the girls and why I was uncomfortable with being a boy. I was really, utterly confused. How could the behavior that I copied from my sister cause so much uproar? I didn't know that there was a manly way of sitting on a sofa. So, in all that confusion, I did the worst thing possible. I got up, cried, and ran out of the room. And you see, this was problematic because, as we all know, boys don't cry. So by the end of the day, the entire grade had found out that I had cried because someone had made fun of me, and that was the day that I found out. There was this big dividing line between the other boys and I. As the years progressed, I was bullied, harassed, called gay, homo, and boys refused to use the urinals next to me because, quote unquote, "You're such a fag, Yash, I don't want you looking at my dick." I didn't know what to do, so I tried to disappear. I forced myself to conform to society's gender strictures. I hid in the bathroom during lunch and deleted social media. I was uncomfortable with being different. When people asked me, "Yash, what sport do you do?" Instead of saying that I train 21 hours a week as a gymnast, I said, I don't exercise, because I didn't want that awkward judging phase when someone always asks me, "But Yash, gymnastics is a sport for girls, isn't it?" I threw away the blue pair of Vans that were too girly for guys, and I grew my hair out of that gay hairstyle that was not in trend for grade 9. Bit by bit, I changed. I let society mold me, removing the undesirable characteristics and replacing them with what was called manly. I evolved. Society has attributed certain mannerisms and ways of presenting yourself into two categories, masculine and feminine, or as I like to call them, the normal and the other. Depending on your gender, what you do, what you wear, and how you present yourself in society is either deemed normal or the other. You're either different or you're normal. You're either different to the norm, which is the norm of being part of the patriarchy. And this is inherently problematic, because the idea that we are either normal or the other is detrimental to the idea of being a man. Because if we see that I am different, it is incredibly detrimental. If we alienate people who are different to the norm, we are not promoting equity. For men, we associate femininity with weakness and masculinity with an inherent strength. We parade masculinity, and this perpetuates toxic norms around men's mental health because we relate masculinity to machismo, the idea of being emotionally and financially strong. So once again, the most common norm is, boys don't cry. I suffer from a classic case of toxic masculinity, the idea that all boys have to present themselves as a certain way in society, the certain way being, once again, the social norm of being a man. And this, again, once again, is problematic because the idea that every man has to be presenting themselves in a certain way perpetuates domination, aggression, and homophobia. But here I want to introduce you to some new ideas, and a term that is often overlooked in this discussion, hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is the practice which legitimizes men's dominant position in society by asserting that there are domination and subordination between men and women. But this is where it gets interesting, because it's not just men dominating women and reaping the benefits of emotionally and financially suppressing women, but it's also men dominating what is deemed to be not a real man. Because in this model, there are 4 categories. There's the hegemonic, the complicit, the subordinate, and the marginalized. Men who either promulgate the system of hegemonic masculinity and reap the benefits of suppressing women fall into the first category. But those who are complicit do not promulgate the system, however, they do accept it. They allow women to be suppressed. They allow women to be oppressed. But those who fall into the other categories are completely different. A subordinate is someone who doesn't practice gender in the same way that the first two categories do. A subordinate thereby is either a homosexual, and then therefore deemed not a real man. A marginalized man is someone who cannot practice gender in the same way, largely due to other forms of social or physical constraints, namely racism or disability. The power interplay between these two different categories is inherently detrimental, as it not only inculcates a sense of misogyny between men and women because there's this hierarchical relationship, but it also inculcates a sense of homophobia, discrimination, and other forms of mental taxation. Heteronormativity and hegemonic masculinity look at the world in black and white. It basically looks at gender as a binary construct and asserts that heterosexuality is the default, preferred, or normal mode of sexual orientation, that masculinity is aggressive, that masculinity is active, whilst femininity is passive, and it is responsible and responsive to the male sexuality. It essentially serves as a mechanism to enable the patriarchy by establishing this somewhat hierarchical relationship between men and women. Because of the gender standards set by the patriarchy, men either fear being vulnerable, leading them to question, am I man enough? And they either fear that or something else, even worse. They fear being destaged from the heteronormative expectation of being the breadwinner for their family. Men are forced into these binary behavioral standards, where it dictates the way that one gesticulates, and it dictates the career path that one takes. But because this is so incredibly detrimental, we have to examine it. Because heteronormativity and hegemonic masculinity inculcates misogyny. By allowing there to be this hierarchical relationship, it's actually creating the potential for the actualization of violence against women. As we can see in rape culture, the explicit violence against women is the sum of latent forms of cultural aggression and cultural oppression. The pervasive sense of degradation, the assertion that women do not have agency, and the constant victimization of women leads to violence against women. If we do not tackle the misogynistic attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions in society, women will never be safe. We have long focused on the systemic oppression against women, but not the root cause of the problem, the men who commit these acts of discrimination. Society needs to teach men to not perpetrate discrimination and not teach women to avoid victimhood. I believe that there is a relationship between tackling toxic masculinity and supporting feminism, and it all lies in our definition of what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. It lies in our definition of femininity and masculinity. By empowering boys to tackle the heteronormative expectation of gender, we can actually influence a cultural change, because all it takes is changing 10% of people's assumptions to influence the majority. By making boys comfortable in their own skin as they grow up, we can enable this confrontation by allowing them to engage in activities that are not deemed normal for boys, and allowing them to understand it's okay to not be okay. We allow them to change the culture of society. The mental health stigma revolving around men is incredibly detrimental, and it is literally killing them. The suicide rate for men is 3.5 times higher than it is for women. And this is largely due to the traditional gender roles, that men shouldn't be engaging with their emotions, that masculinity needs you to present yourself as persistently powerful, persistently assertive, but mental health is a sign of lack of personal fortitude. So how is that strong? That doesn't associate itself with what we deem to be a man. So, as we can see, and the American Psychological Association concurs, toxic masculinity leads to increased rates of depression, mental health issues, and the underreporting of mental health issues. We should teach children to be angry with society. We should teach children to be angry with gender, because gender is, as Adichie puts it, a grave injustice, and we do a great disservice to boys on how we raise them. By defining masculinity so narrowly, we make it into a tight cage and teach boys to fear vulnerability. We teach boys to fear emasculation and the rising power of women, when instead, we should be teaching them to value and respect all. That is the essence of feminism. As we can see, there is a responsibility that falls on us, all of us, not just the future changemakers of the world in the room, but the parents and the educators as well. Why? Here, I'd like to delve into the theoretical underpinnings of gender and gender expression. Now, I don't want to inundate you with a whole bunch of things that you're going to forget the moment you walk out this door. So I'm going to present to you a synthesis of theories from different backgrounds, showing you that the true perpetrator of discrimination is society and its teachings. In Judith Butler's argument on gender performativity, she declares that being born male or being born female doesn't determine the way you act. Instead, we align ourselves to fit in with society. In gender schema theory, Bem says that from the early stage of social and societal development, we change ourselves to fit in with the cultural norm of that specific gender. And in Heidegger's existential approach to the meaning of human life and the human condition, he states that we have two masks, an internal mask and a social mask. Our internal mask is our true self, but we hide that. We hide that with our social mask, which is consisting of what society wants us to be. So, as we can see, society is to blame. Society defines who we are because it defines the normative expression of gender and it determines social structures. But what can we do? As a society, we need to work towards redefining what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. But how can we do that? Through education reform. Schools are the basis for our interactions in society. It teaches us how to work and play and teach each other in society. Its teachings range from all kinds of things, such as economics and science, to mathematics and music. But not many schools talk about issues such as feminism, such as gender stereotypes, toxic masculinity, and other issues that arise thereof. It is imperative for schools to start talking about these issues. It is imperative for us to start discussing feminism, to start discussing gender stereotypes, gender injustice, in order to cultivate equity for the future. The pervasive phenomenon of toxic masculinity is inherently detrimental. It cultivates and exacerbates misogynistic mindsets, which hinders feminism in the future. Behind me is a survey conducted by our LGBTQIA+ organization in school 2 years ago. It was talking about homophobia and how it manifests in school. The majority of respondents stated that homophobia manifests in offhanded remarks, with many stating that these were often unintentional. Unintentional, offhanded remarks often stem from a lack of education, a lack of awareness, and a lack of sympathy. And then these manifest in even more terrible ways of homophobic bullying, such as exclusion and hate crime. But what interested me the most was that many people stated that these issues were largely systemic. These issues were from the administration, because the administration did not act upon nor acknowledge homophobic bullying. We need to recognize teachers as agents of change who can influence the future generations, who can influence our mindsets and inculcate an open-minded nature. Because when a teacher does not treat a homophobic remark in the same way that they would treat another remark of a derogatory nature, they are in itself perpetuating discrimination and perpetrating homophobia. Behind me are other forms of gender-based injustice that students in our school have faced, and these are direct quotes taken from surveys or interactions with students in our school. We have long focused on the systemic oppression of women, but not the root of the problem, as I said before. Because we need to look at the root of the problem not only being the way that we raise boys, but the way that we educate them as well. We need education reform and personal social education modules for not only students, but teachers. We need to teach teachers how to teach these students and how to influence them to become feminists. We need to introduce them to topics such as intersectionality in order to inculcate a feminist culture. Because then and only then can we start to teach them about bigger issues, such as misogyny, and influence change in the future. And then and only then can we start to empower individuals to become their true selves. When we redefine what it means to be a girl in society, we can work towards inhibiting sexualization and objectification, thus removing the potential for self-image problems and decreasing the ability for women to feel shame and anxiety and the ability for men to perpetrate hate crime against women. I wanted to give you this TED Talk today because I wanted to try and empower you to define yourself for who you wish to be and not what other people wish you to be. I want you to go home and look at yourself in the mirror and appreciate yourself for who you truly are, because God knows how long it took me to do so. It took me a very long time to overcome toxic masculinity and appreciate who I really was on the inside. I'm Yash Mahajan, a senior ready to graduate from high school and attend the University of Pennsylvania. An artist, a gymnast, a feminist, someone who has finally appreciated himself for who he truly is. A boy who's finally built up that wall of confidence that can no longer be torn down by derision. A boy who realized that there's no point hiding who he is, because if he wants to make a change, he has to understand that he is different. But when I leave, I think I'm going to leave happy. That's very strange, isn't it? Because most graduates don't want to be happy when they leave. They're going to miss their school. But I think that I'm leaving behind a legacy. And this does make me happy, because the legacy that I leave behind is that it's okay to be different. Because different is just normal in another context. Thank you.